Okay, so going on from the last video I did about bad and dirty driving habits, I'm just going to add some things to that. These are things that people do without realizing it. Sometimes they know what they're doing and they do it deliberately. But the first thing I want to look at is some things that happen on motorways. And one of the things that can happen is when you're driving along on the motorway, you don't realize it, but your speed yo-yos. It goes up and down for no reason. So obviously if you're driving in traffic and the traffic is slowing down and speeding up, starting and stopping, you've got a responsibility to try and keep your speed consistent. So look further down the road. Every time the traffic accelerates, think that they might then brake again and try and keep your speed consistent to help all the vehicles behind you. The reason that we have traffic jams on motorways is because of something called the concertina effect. It's the start-stop effect. If the traffic's flowing really well, all it takes is one person to brake unnecessarily, and that creates a domino effect behind them where everybody else has to brake. And before you know it, the traffic can actually come to a stop on the motorway for no reason, just because one idiot was speeding up and braking for no reason. So think about that. You do have a responsibility to drive for everybody else. That's something good drivers do. They don't drive for themselves, they drive for everybody else. So they're driving courteously and they're driving with etiquette and they're not blocking junctions, and they're taking the responsibility of the lead vehicle when they come to traffic lights to anticipate the traffic lights and slow down early to try and keep everything behind them rolling if the light's red, so that when you get to the traffic light, by the time you get to the traffic light, it turns green and everything keeps rolling without stopping. So a good driver uses a lot of courtesy on the road. So one of the things that can happen on the motorway is you're driving along and you're in lane 1. So the lanes are 1, 2, 3. There's no slow, middle and fast lane. The speed limit in all the lanes is the same, unless there's temporary speed restrictions or there's lane closures. But the speed limit on a motorway in the UK is 70 miles an hour for a car in all 3 lanes. And what can happen sometimes is you're driving along and you're driving along in lane 1 and a lorry or a coach comes past you, and you're just minding your own business at 55 miles an hour, and as the lorry or coach comes past you, you realize they've come past you and you start to speed up. Well, the reason that they've come past you is some of these vehicles are limited to 100 kilometers an hour in the case of coaches, which is 62 miles an hour. And if the coach driver's got a long journey, for example, London to Edinburgh, he's going to put the coach on the cruise control and set it to the maximum possible speed. So he's going along in lane 2 and he goes to overtake you. And suddenly you wake up and you realize that there's a lorry or a coach coming past you and you speed up. Now that's just irritating, because the driver who's trying to overtake you now has the problem that the vehicle in lane 1, you, has now speeded up. And other vehicles behind you might start to pass them on the left. And the thing to remember is lorries and coaches can't use the outside lane of a 3-lane motorway. They can use the outside lane if it's 2 lanes, but if it's 3 lanes, they can't use the outside. So the next most irritating thing is people who hog the middle lane. So people are driving along maybe at 55, 60 miles an hour in the middle lane, and then you've got a coach that comes up behind them at 62. And the coach driver, again, he's trying to get to Edinburgh or Glasgow or wherever he's going. It's far away. And he set the cruise control. And as he comes up behind this vehicle in the middle lane, doing less than 60, the vehicle doesn't move. Well, now the coach driver's got a problem because he can't use the outside lane to overtake. He's prohibited from doing that. And he can't pass on the left because that would be undertaking. So the idiot who sits in the middle lane is effectively blocking all 3 lanes for the lorry or for the coach. So remember, the first rule of the road is to keep to the left unless you're turning right or you're overtaking. So when you're driving on a motorway, if there's nothing around you, keep left. Even if you're keeping up with the flow of traffic, unless you're overtaking, you need to keep to the left, keep in lane 1, yeah? So just to recap, don't let your speed yo-yo, where every time you find that someone's passing you, you speed up and you irritate them by making it more difficult for them to overtake. And don't hog the middle lane. As I say, with any road, the rule of the road is keep to the left unless you're overtaking or turning right. some people think that because the speed limit on the motorway is 70, they can sit in the middle lane or the outside lane at 70. Well, that's totally wrong. And even the police drivers that do that are totally wrong. The law applies to everybody, and once you finish overtaking, you should return to the left. There's only one exception where I would not use the first lane of the motorway, and this is where I don't agree with the highway code and I don't agree with the highways agency, and that is at night time where there's no hard shoulder and there's no lighting. Because I've had it when I was doing a 2 a.m. start, and I had to be at Ingatstone for rail replacement at about 3 o'clock in the morning, where I was on the M25 in lane 1. There was no lighting on this particular stretch near Hertfordshire, and there was a broken down van in the first lane. It probably had an electrical problem because the battery must have been dying, because the hazard lights were very, very dim. And I was going along, and luckily I saw it, and I managed to change lanes. And I thought to myself, this is bloody stupid. It's a so-called smart motorway, which is a stupid motorway, really. There's no street lighting, and there's no hard shoulder. So had the lights in that van gone out completely, I wouldn't have seen it until quite late. And the only exception, as I say to you, the only exception where I wouldn't stay in lane 1 is at night time on a smart motorway with no lighting. I think in that situation, any intelligent person would realise that lane 1 effectively becomes the hard shoulder, and more so if it's foggy or if it's raining, because I believe that every motorway should have a hard shoulder, and I think the government are wrong. People have died where they've not had any safe refuge when the vehicle's broken down and they've been hit by traffic in lane 1. So that's the only exception, guys, but I would always keep left unless overtaking and turning right. The next thing that relates to motorways is drivers that don't understand the concept of zip merging. Now, if you're on the slip road here, it's your responsibility to use the slip road to get up to motorway speeds. So it's your job to make sure, if it's clear and flowing correctly, that you're at 70 by the time you want to join the motorway. It's irritating when drivers don't understand this, and they'll join the motorway quite slowly. It makes it very difficult for the traffic on the motorway. Everybody has to brake to accommodate them. And in the same way, when you're leaving the motorway, remember, keep your speed up until you get onto the slip road and do your braking on the slip road. Don't slow down too early, because again, that affects the traffic on the motorway. But when the traffic's a bit heavier, there is a certain responsibility, because of manners and etiquette, for the traffic on the motorway to leave a sufficient gap for vehicles to come on. Now, in America, if you've driven on the highways, people tend to drive nose to tail, and they don't think about traffic trying to join the highway or the freeway. And it's very difficult for traffic to do that. They have to sort of force their way out. But here, most people have got common sense, and they realise that you need to keep a safe gap of at least 3 seconds if the weather's good, and 4 seconds if you're driving a large vehicle or the weather's bad. So if everybody keeps a 4-second gap, that helps traffic coming onto the motorway, because there are bigger gaps between the cars. So what we do is what we call a zip merge. So, for example, if there's a car there, he lets this first vehicle out, and then after the first vehicle's gone, the second car behind him, that might be there now, he lets the second vehicle out. So you get one vehicle from there, one vehicle from here, one vehicle there, and one vehicle there. So it's called zip merging, because like the teeth on a zip, you get one from each side. And the problem is, some people who've come to this country, and maybe some people who've learned to drive in this country, don't understand the etiquette of zip merging, and they'll just drive nose to tail, and they won't allow space for vehicles to join the motorway. Or conversely, some people, when they're joining the motorway, will try and push out. So once the vehicle in front of them is joined, they'll push out and they'll try and push out into that same gap. Well, the car there has let one car out. You can't expect him to let every car out. So once he's let a car out, you then go behind him. You don't push in front of him. You zip merge. And it's irritating when people don't understand the concept of zip merging. But that applies for everywhere. That applies for car parks. That applies for minor roads and high streets. Everywhere where the traffic has to merge and give way. It's good to zip merge. So the next thing that relates to driving not on a motorway this time, but driving anywhere really, is when people stop to give way to other cars, but they don't realize there's nothing behind them. So, for example, if this isn't the motorway now, if you just imagine it's just a normal road. So the car there decides he's going to give way to the car joining the main road. Well, what happens sometimes is people do that. They'll slow down or stop and flash somebody, and they haven't checked their mirrors, so they don't realize there's nothing behind them. If that guy just had to carry on, the road behind him is absolutely clear, there's nothing there, and this car could have just kept rolling and joined. It's probably safer for this car if he'd gone first, because then this car could see better if there's any cyclists or pedestrians, or not pedestrians, but any cyclists or any other vehicles behind him. But by him stopping there, especially if it's a large vehicle like a bus or a lorry, he's made it very difficult for this car to see what's around him. So if you're driving along and there's nothing behind you, don't give way, just keep moving, because the joining vehicle can get in behind you more easily. So it's irritating when people do that. But it's obviously because they haven't checked their mirrors and they're not aware that there's nothing behind them. So try not to do that. The next thing, similar to that in some ways, it's when drivers sit in another vehicle's blind spot. So for example, you're driving along the road or a motorway, and there's a bus or a lorry there, and you just sit there. So that driver there is doing 60 miles an hour, and you just sit on his rear bumper and you sit in his blind spot. What you've got to realize is that vehicle, that large vehicle, or it can even be another car, something might happen in front of them where they have to suddenly take evasive action. There could be a vehicle in front of them that breaks down or stops suddenly, or even a collision. That vehicle could have a burst tire, and something might make that vehicle suddenly swerve or weave into your lane. And if you're sitting right behind him, right on his bumper in his blind spot, there's a chance that if he has to take evasive action suddenly, he might well hit you. So don't do that. If there's a large vehicle, go in front of them or drop back at least 3 seconds behind them. Yeah, you need what we call diagonal separation. Now, this isn't taught in the highway code. It isn't taught anywhere as far as I'm aware, but I'm teaching you this now. When we follow another vehicle, we should keep a gap of a minimum, really, of 3 seconds behind that vehicle. Well, if you're in lane 2, you still need to keep a gap behind that vehicle. We need what we call diagonal separation. So I would keep, ideally, a 3-second gap there, or in some cases, if the traffic's moving more slowly, a 2-second gap there. But you have what we call diagonal separation. And it's important to realize, as I say, I've never heard it taught by anybody else. I'm teaching you this now, but it isn't taught in the highway code, and I don't think driving instructors teach their trainees this when you're learning to drive a car. But diagonal separation, yeah? It seems really obvious when I tell you, it seems like common sense, but believe me, there are so many things that people just don't think about or just haven't been taught. So, yeah. Now, aside from motorways, there are other things to consider. One of them relates to signals. You get these so-called experts who criticize people for not signaling. Yeah, I think BMW drivers sometimes come in for a lot of criticism for not signaling, but really advanced drivers tend not to signal as much. Newer drivers, learner drivers, and less experienced drivers tend to over signal. I'm going to get onto that in a minute, but basically, when you go to do the examiner's course at Cardington or wherever they hold it now, what they teach the examiners is, if there's nothing around you, if there's no one to benefit from a signal, you don't need to signal. Believe it or not, more experienced drivers a lot of the time will not signal if there's nothing around them. The best example of drivers who don't signal are emergency service vehicles, police, paramedics, fire engines, because when they're on a blue light run, they use the blue light and the siren to clear the road from them. And although now they have telemetry in the vehicle that does record if they're using the signal or not, and they're told to signal, the actual the psychology of the way they drive is that they let the blue light and the siren do the work, and they just allow the traffic to part and then make their way through. And these drivers, who are amongst the best drivers on the road, more often than not, you'll find them not signaling. They don't need to, because what they're doing is they're using the speed and the position of the vehicle to show other traffic what they're doing. So in the same way, if you went off to Cardington and did the examiner's course, a lot of those roads are around Bedfordshire, countryside roads. If there's nothing around you, you would be criticised if you signalled unnecessarily, because there's nothing around you. There's no one to benefit from your signal. So a good example, for example, is if you're coming up to a junction and turning left and there's nothing around you, why signal? By positioning your vehicle a little bit to the left and pointing it where you're going, everybody can see your intention. And if there's nothing behind you and nothing coming from either side, don't signal. It's just not worth it. Nobody can benefit from it. So rather than criticizing people for not signaling, as some so-called experts do, one of the things that's actually much worse than that is when you give a misleading signal. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So imagine you're driving along and there's a road. There's a road on the left. Okay. And you're here. And you intend to pull up here. Maybe there's a driveway, maybe there's a lay-by, but you intend to pull up here. And as you're coming along, you put the left signal on. Just imagine if there's a motorcycle or a car that intends to emerge onto this road. When you signal left, they're going to think that you're going to go in here, and they might pull out, and that could cause a collision. Why? Because that's a misleading signal. You've signaled too early. Your intention is to stop here, but you've told the other vehicles that you're going to turn in here. And same way, what you get sometimes on other roads is, for example, there's a road on the right here, and you might have a parked vehicle here. Now, as you're driving along, you see the parked vehicle, and you're back here, and you put the right signal on. Now, you intend to go around the parked vehicle, but you haven't noticed that there's a road on the right here. And by putting that right signal on, traffic behind you might think you're turning in here, or even traffic coming towards you might stop and flash you because they think you want to go in there. Yeah. So don't give misleading signals. Misleading signals are actually worse than not signaling at all. And we see this a lot at roundabouts where drivers go around the roundabout and they keep the right indicator on as they go around the roundabout, and they don't change it to a left signal when they're leaving the roundabout. And traffic waiting to come on thinks that they're going to carry on around to the right because they haven't cancelled their signal and given a left signal to tell everybody that they're leaving the roundabout. It makes it look like the traffic's doing a U-turn when in fact they're exiting. Another example of where you can give a misleading signal is, especially for a bus driver, and this is something you can actually fail your bus driving test for, is if you're going along and you intend to turn left and there's a bus stop here, right? And as you're driving along, you put the signal on before you pass the bus stop because you intend to turn left. Now, in a car driving test or a lorry driving test, this wouldn't apply. You wouldn't get marked down for this because cars and lorries generally don't stop at bus stops. But on a bus test, if you put the left signal on before you get to the bus stop because you intend to turn left, you'll get a mark for that. And if it leads to somebody trying to overtake you, or somebody maybe pulling out from the junction because they think you're stopping at the bus stop, when in actual fact you're going to turn left, somebody might pull out in front of you. If it creates a dangerous situation, you could actually fail your test for that. It could lead to a serious mark because you've told people the wrong information. You've told them that you're going to stop at the bus stop, when in actual fact you intend to pass the bus stop and turn left. It's a misleading signal. So remember what I said now. Don't listen to all these armchair experts who talk about, oh, he didn't signal and he pulled out and, use your signals, mate, all the rest of it. No, misleading signals are actually much worse. And that leads, I suppose, on to the lack of etiquette on the road. I mean, I spoke earlier about experienced drivers don't drive for themselves, they drive for everybody. So they drive in such a way that they're creating safety as they go along. Now, what do I mean by that? Sometimes people refer to something they call defensive driving. Well, to me, it's not defensive driving, it's actually creative driving. And the reason I say that is defensive driving makes it seem like you're always reacting to things, you're always on the back foot. But really what you're doing is you're creating safe situations as you go along. So as you're driving along, if you leave a 3 or 4 second gap to you and the vehicle in front, you've created a safe zone in front of you. If the vehicle suddenly stops in front of you, you've got time and space to stop. By positioning yourself in the middle of 2 lanes, by straddling sometimes, you're creating a safe zone behind you. And you're stopping vehicles from passing you that could collide with you if you're turning left or right. And the same way, by driving at a consistent speed and braking smoothly, you're creating a safe zone behind you because the vehicles behind you aren't having to suddenly brake because you suddenly brake. So I don't think of it as defensive driving, I think of it as creative driving. And a good driver, as I said, drives everybody on the road. They think about the concertina effect. They think about the start-stop in traffic, and they try and keep their vehicle rolling to help everybody behind them rolling. They don't block junctions. I mean, the council haven't got enough money to go painting yellow box junction every single junction. If they did that, our council taxes would go up. But a good driver reads the road ahead and makes sure that when they stop, if they have to stop, that they don't block junctions, especially if there's a chance of emergency vehicles crossing your path, for example, near a fire station, a hospital, or even near a police station where they might be pulling out, and you really don't want to block the path of an emergency vehicle. Going on from that, again, going a little bit deeper into the training side, a lot of people ask me that, is my job stressful when I'm teaching people to drive buses? And it can be at times, but the stress usually doesn't come from near misses or near collisions, because we are always gauging the talent of the trainee and seeing whether they're driving within their capacity and selecting the appropriate roads for them. So we're not overwhelming the trainee by taking them into very difficult situations that they're not ready for. What can be more stressful, in fact, because obviously we've got the brake pedal, we can slow the vehicle down or stop it if we need to using the dual controls. What is more stressful for us is actually the fact that we can't unbrake the trainee. And what do I mean by that? Well, say for example, if we're driving along and somebody opens a car door or walks out in front of us, if the trainee doesn't respond, we can brake for them, and we can, tell them, we had to intervene, we had to brake for you because you didn't react. But what's much more dangerous is when the trainee panic brakes, we can't unbrake them. And I'll give you a good example of that. Many years ago, we were going along the M25 near the junction of the M23, which is a fast downhill stretch. The traffic was moderate. We were travelling along at about 62, 63 miles an hour because I had a Metro bus, Metro 1023, which would do 65 miles an hour downhill. And we were coming off at the M23 junction, and I said to the trainee, I said, right, we're going to take the next exit. I said, I want you to signal and take the next exit, and we're going to be heading towards Croydon. And for some reason, the trainee, who probably didn't have a lot of experience driving on motorways in this country, signalled and started to steer into the hard shoulder. And I immediately said, no, I said, not yet, you need to stay on the motorway, so get back. When I said that, he started to steer back into lane 1. But because of the confusion, he then started to brake quite heavily because he perhaps thought that he missed the exit or something like that. Now, at the time, there was an articulated lorry behind us. And when he braked, I immediately looked into the mirrors and I saw that we were slowing down quite rapidly. And this lorry was getting close to us. And there's nothing I could do. And I had to say to him, get off the brake, press the gas. Because I was worried that the articulated lorry might not be able to stop in time. He might collide with the back of the bus. So that was quite stressful, actually. So it's not the fact that I can't brake the vehicle. It's the fact that I can't unbrake the vehicle. And in the same way, if there's any pedal confusion when we're driving along and for some reason the trainee presses the brake too hard, I can't unbrake the trainee. So that's something that perhaps people have never thought about and aren't aware of when you teach people to drive. Going on from that, whenever I teach people to drive, I try not to introduce stress into the training. There's enough stress on the road itself. The courses, the circuits that I use to build up their confidence and build up their experience. I think I mentioned before that I use various circuits around London. For the very first drive on the road, I might use Scotch, Common and Ealing, which is a series of 4 roundabouts with gentle left and right turns just to get them used to driving the bus. As they get more proficient, I'd use the Uxbridge Road from Southall down to Uxbridge, because that's great for changing lanes. It teaches you how to look far ahead, because the roads, the design of the road's absolutely rubbish. I mean, whoever did that bus corridor have obviously never driven a large vehicle, and the lanes aren't orientated correctly. So you've got to keep moving out, moving in, moving out, moving in to serve the bus stops and to overtake. As they get more experience, I might take them to the U3 route around West Drayton and Hillingdon, which is great for left and right turns. And then beyond that, take them to Richmond Town Centre, which is really, really tight. Lots of meeting situations, blind corners, meeting situations around blind corners, and meeting situations where you're on the wrong side of the road. So all that really, really stresses the trainee, pressure tests them. And because they're under so much pressure, I try and keep them as calm as possible, tell them the odd joke, maybe start whistling as we're driving along, just do something to lighten the mood. Because as an instructor, you don't want to introduce stress into that relationship between you and the trainee. You want the trainee to trust you and be able to, confide in you or ask you questions. You have to be approachable. So it's not about being miserable or being stern. It's about making sure that, if you think about the analogy, and this is very important when it comes to flying planes, in the cockpit of an airliner, no matter how senior the captain is, the first officer always has to have the confidence and has to have the reassurance that if they don't agree with something, if they're not happy with the captain's decision, they're allowed to speak up and challenge the captain, because the captain might be making a mistake which could endanger the life of everybody on the aircraft. And it's the first officer's job, actually, to monitor the captain and make sure that they're not doing anything dangerous. So this is something where in some airlines in the Far East and Middle East, there has been a problem with what they call the cockpit gradient, where very junior first officers don't have the confidence to challenge very senior captains, and there have been many cases where aircraft have crashed because of what we call the cockpit gradient. The very experienced captains sometimes ridicule or don't listen to their junior first officers. Well, as I said, it's the job of the first officer to check every decision that the captain makes. In the same way, if the role was reversed and the first officer was actually the pilot flying and the captain was the pilot not flying, it's the job of the captain to check the first officer to make sure they're doing everything correctly. So with the trainees, I like them to have that confidence that they can talk to me, or they can sometimes ask me questions or even challenge me if there's something they don't understand or don't agree with, as long as they do it politely. And going on from that, I just want to talk about what you think makes a good driver. Well, people have their own opinions about what makes a good driver, but let me tell you now, it's not as simple as what you think. The first thing that makes a good driver, as I said, is basic etiquette. It's the same kind of thing you would find in any walk of life. If somebody's got manners and they're respectful and they've got good etiquette, it's obvious, it shows. So if you're driving and you're driving considerately and you're letting people out and you're driving in a safe, courteous way, that's really obvious for everybody to see. It's not rocket science, it's psychology. It's just basic psychology that people can see that you're a courteous and skillful driver. Beyond that, it's the ability to deal with multiple problems at the same time. Now, the brain can't actually multitask. Multitasking is a myth. But what we do is we switch between tasks very, very quickly. So a good driver is able to track multiple things on the road. You might have a cycle in front of you. You might have somebody trying to cross the road on the opposite side. You might have a traffic light changing from green to amber. You might have a crossing coming up. You may have a meeting situation. You may have an emergency vehicle coming towards you. A good driver can track all these things at the same time. They can soften their focus and they can see everything. And this is something that learners struggle with. They're sometimes only able to see one thing at a time or deal with one thing at a time. And if you watch my other videos about dot-to-dot thinking, I explain how some people are only able to look into the near field, which is the area directly in front of the vehicle, and they're not able to see the midfield and the far field at the same time. They have very limited depth of vision, and why it's really important to keep your gaze, keep your attention as far as you can down the road in the far field, and deal with things that are happening closer to you in your peripheral vision. So you're not staring at things nearby, things that are just in front of you, because if you do that, you will not see anything developing down the road. Everything will be blurred. So it's really important to keep your eyes as far as you can down the road, and use your peripheral vision. That's one of the things that really separates experienced drivers from learners. It's peripheral vision. It's the ability to see something in the corner of your eye. Because what you've got to understand is we don't really see with our eyes, we see with our brain. The eyes just feed the information, the light, into the eye. But the picture of the world around us is created in our brain. And what happens with experienced drivers is their brain tells the eyes where to look. So when you're driving along, you know where the danger is. It might be a crossing coming up, it might be a school, it might be a blind corner. So your brain tells your eyes, right, that's where the danger is most likely going to be coming from, and you look there. But with inexperienced drivers, their brain isn't really in control. They see things, and then the picture of what they've seen goes to the brain, and then the brain thinks, right, what do I have to do about this now? So they're always on the back foot. They're always reacting to things. But really experienced drivers, they see things in their brain before the eyes see it on the road. So you're predicting, you're creating a worst case scenario in your brain as you're driving along, thinking about what could happen. And when it does happen, you're ready for it, and you can act more efficiently, you can act a bit quicker, and you can deal with the situation a lot more safely, because you're seeing it in your brain before you see it on the road. And that takes time. I mean, I would say even when we have people who've got a couple of years car driving experience, it probably takes 3 to 4 weeks before we can get them to that stage in the bus. Some people find it easier than others, but it's important to understand that everything is psychology, and you have to be predicting these things in your mind before you actually see them with your eyes. And finally, finishing up with a couple of other little things that people don't think about when they're driving, a lack of etiquette or bad manners. And that's maybe opening the driver's or passenger's door without looking in their mirror. Well, if you've driven a large vehicle, especially a bus, and you've got standing passengers, you know how irritating it is when somebody opens the door in the vehicle without looking, because if you're not able to swerve to avoid that door, the only option you've got left is to brake, and it could mean that passengers fall over. Well, most drivers, experienced drivers, they make allowances for this and they slow down when they're passing parked vehicles. But you can always tell a good driver the way they act outside the car. So a really good driver, when they're crossing the road as a pedestrian, they will walk up to about 1 meter away from the edge of the road. They will present themselves and stand back and look for traffic that might be passing. They won't go right up to the edge of the road and try and intimidate traffic into stopping for them, or they wouldn't run out in front of another vehicle. A really good driver would have the same sense of courtesy and etiquette when they themselves are a pedestrian. I had a situation a couple of days ago where I was driving my car and I was coming up to a zebra crossing, and somebody just walked straight out in front of me. Luckily I saw them and I predicted what they were going to do, and I slowed down, but they just approached the crossing and just walked straight out. No etiquette. They didn't stand there. They didn't give me time to stop. They just walked straight out in front of me. And I thought to myself, if I'd been a less experienced driver, maybe you would have got run over, because the driver wouldn't have had maybe the sense to be looking out for you. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to stop because they couldn't have reacted in time. But a good driver will always behave with etiquette when they're a pedestrian, and even when their vehicle stops. So a good driver would never open the door and force another vehicle to brake or to swerve to avoid their door. And so it's easy when you're driving down the road to see who the bad drivers are, because the bad drivers are the bad drivers that don't have any etiquette, that don't have any manners, that don't drive with courtesy, and they don't have any respect for the rules of the road or other motorists. And with that, that concludes this lesson.